You know how we're always looking for that quick way to really grasp something?
Yeah.
Those aha moments?
Yeah, getting right to the heart of it.
Exactly. Well, today we're doing just that with a story many people think they already know.
Okay.
We're diving into Turkish prisons. Specifically, comparing that famous movie Midnight Express
Ugh.
from 1978.
Oh, right. Very controversial film.
Hugely.
Ah.
Comparing its depiction to what was really going on
Right.
back then and what's happening now.
So, moving beyond the Hollywood sensationalism.
That's the plan. You probably heard of the movie, maybe seen it. We want to unpack the real story, past and present.
That's a really important distinction because Midnight Express definitely cast a long shadow, shaped how people saw Turkish prisons for, well, decades.
For sure.
So our goal today is to use the film almost as a starting point, a window maybe.
Way to put it.
Yeah, to explore the truth. We'll be looking at historical context, human rights reports from different groups,
Yeah.
and some pretty powerful firsthand accounts, too.
Mm-hmm.
Just to really understand, okay, how accurate was the film? What's really changed in the, 5 decades since? Has the system genuinely evolved?
Exactly. We've got some great material here. Excerpts on the history, the actual conditions, the abuses people documented, and importantly, the reform efforts since the movie came out.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's kick things off with the film itself, the scandal it caused.
Right. Midnight Express, 1978. Alan Parker directed it, based on Billy Hayes' book. And it was, truly shocking for audiences at the time.
How so? What did it show?
It showed Sazmakiler prison in Istanbul, and it did not hold back. It depicted just terrible conditions, severe overcrowding, almost no sanitation to speak of, vermin, rats, very grim, just a fundamental lack of basic human dignity, according to the film.
And it wasn't just the physical stuff, right? It got into the abuse, too.
Oh, absolutely. It portrayed really graphic human rights abuses, brutal beatings by guards, torture, and this sense of a corrupt legal system, especially for foreigners like Hayes. Like they were just trapped indefinitely. No real legal help, no hope. Those scenes were powerful.
I can imagine. What was the reaction?
Huge international outrage. It put Turkish prisons under this intense global spotlight, Suddenly everyone was talking about it. Diplomatic pressure. Calls for reform.
So it had a real impact.
Undeniably. But, and this is really important, the film got a lot of criticism too.
Oh, from who?
Especially from Turkey, obviously. Many felt it was exaggerated, unfair, that it relied on stereotypes for drama.
Okay.
And even Billy Hayes himself, years later, admitted the film took creative liberties. He said it amplified the violence and, interestingly, left out positive interactions he actually had with some Turkish prisoners and even guards.
Huh. That's a crucial piece of context.
It really is. So we can't take the movie as like a documentary.
Right.
But
Right.
It definitely drew the world's attention to what were, by many accounts, very real and serious problems in the system back then. Systemic flaws.
Got it.
Hmm.
So not pure fact, but it highlighted something real. To understand that something better, let's step back. What was Turkey like in the 1970s?
Yeah, good question. The 70s in Turkey were turbulent. A lot of political instability, serious economic problems, social unrest.
Like specifically?
Well, you had clashes, sometimes violent ones, between left-wing and right-wing groups. It got so bad that martial law was declared in several areas.
Wow.
And the prison system wasn't separate from all that. It really reflected those broader issues, often underfunded, poorly managed.
So that instability kind of bled into the prisons. What
Yeah.
did that look like inside? What were the key problems?
Overcrowding was just endemic, massive problem. Places like Sasmaakalar, the prison in the film, were built for maybe a few hundred people, but they often held thousands. Thousands.
You're kidding. How did they even manage?
Badly. Imagine the strain on everything. Food, sanitation, space. Disease spread like wildfire, obviously.
And the buildings themselves?
Often old, crumbling, just not equipped. Reports from the time talk about, lack of basic sanitation, poor ventilation, no heating, overflowing toilets, contaminated water. It sounds horrific.
Just awful basic living conditions. What about the human element? The guards, corruption?
Yeah, unfortunately, reports suggest abuse and corruption were widespread too. Guards were often poorly trained, probably underpaid, facing difficult conditions themselves.
And they took it out on the prisoners.
It seems violence was a common way to maintain control in those overcrowded places. And bribery was apparently common too.
For what? Better treatment?
Yeah, maybe better food, slightly better conditions, maybe even influencing release.
Yeah.
if you had money, supposedly.
And what about foreigners like Billy Hayes? Was it worse for them?
They faced extra challenges for sure. Language barriers, obviously, limited access to help from their embassies, their consulates, and sadly, reports of prejudice against foreigners within the system.
Any idea how many foreigners were caught up in this?
Well, the U.S. State Department noted over 200 Americans were detained in Turkey in the 70s, mostly for drug offenses, and a lot of them reported mistreatment.
So Hayes wasn't entirely alone in that experience. Were there other accounts that back this up?
Yes, there were. For instance, a British prisoner, David Carter, was also jailed there in the 70s. His accounts talk about similar things: beatings, not enough food, malnutrition, and serious psychological torment.
So these firsthand stories suggest Midnight Express, while maybe dialing up the drama.
Right, while maybe exaggerating some parts, it did reflect some genuine, brutal realities of the system at that time.
Okay, that gives us a pretty grim picture of the 1970s. Let's shift gears now. How does that compare to today? What are Turkish prisons like now, starting with those basic living conditions?
Well, back then, as we said, conditions were often described as squalid. Moldy food, bad water, lice, rats, just miserable.
You mentioned an Amnesty International report from '75.
Yeah, that one describes cells in Ankara's Ulupenlar prison as basically uninhabitable. Said you'd have maybe 20 prisoners crammed into a space meant for 5.
Uninhabitable. Wow. And the human rights violations, were they as bad as the film made out?
The evidence, unfortunately, suggests they were pretty bad back then. Physical abuse seems to have been common. Guards using batons, electric shocks. There were even reports of falaka.
What's falaka?
It's beating the soles of the feet. Incredibly brutal. And psychological abuse, too. Solitary confinement, threats, mock executions were reported. And it's often noted that political prisoners got the worst of it during times of political crackdown.
Just awful. What about basic rights?
Yeah,
Medical care, lawyers?
Severely lacking back then. Medical care was minimal, often delayed. Contact with family or lawyers was heavily restricted, monitored. The legal process itself was often unclear, confusing, leaving people stuck in limbo.
You can see how that would break someone down psychologically.
Absolutely. Constant fear, depression. Hayes escaping seems almost like a desperate last resort in that context.
Right. Okay, so that was then. Fast forward to today. What's the situation now with these same issues? Let's start with overcrowding again. Is that still a problem?
Unfortunately, yes. Overcrowding is still a major issue. Actually, the prison population in Turkey has exploded in recent years.
Really? How much?
It went from around, say, 50,000 in the 90s to over 300,000 by 2023.
Whoa. Why such a massive increase?
A big driver was the political purges after the failed coup attempt in 2016. Huge numbers of people were arrested and imprisoned.
And the prisons couldn't cope.
Exactly. A Council of Europe report in 2022 found many prisons are running way over capacity, like 120 to 150% full. People sharing beds, sleeping on floors. Still happening.
That's deeply concerning. Still overcrowded after all these years. What about sanitation in the buildings themselves? Any improvements there?
There has been some progress, especially with newer prisons, the F-types they started building in the 2000s. They tend to have better sanitation, maybe better medical facilities.
But not all prisons are new F-types.
No, definitely not. A lot of older prisons are still in use, and many remain substandard. Human Rights Watch reported in 2021 on poor hygiene in Diyarbakir prison, for example, problems with clean water, showers.
So modernization, but it's patchy, not across the board.
Pretty much, yeah.
And what about human rights abuses? Torture, beatings. Are those allegations still surfacing today?
Regrettably, yes. Allegations of abuse are still a significant concern for human rights groups.
So is targeted.
Often the reports focus on political prisoners, journalists, activists, people detained under those broad anti-terror laws, especially post-2016.
Any specific examples?
Amnesty International put out a report in 2023 documenting credible cases of torture in Silivri prison. Things like severe beatings, even sexual assault allegations, and prolonged solitary confinement is still frequently cited as a major concern.
That's incredibly serious. Has there been any progress on prisoners getting access to their basic rights, like doctors and lawyers?
Well, on paper, there have been reforms. Things like telemedicine, remote doctor visits, and supposedly better access to lawyers were introduced after 2000.
But in practice?
It seems implementation is inconsistent. It varies a lot between prisons. And again, political prisoners often face more restrictions on getting medical care or seeing their lawyers.
And foreigners, still facing the same old problems.
While the number of foreign prisoners might be lower now, reports suggest those who are incarcerated still struggle with language barriers and delays in getting help from their consulates. some familiar echoes there.
It really sounds like many core issues persist, even if the surface looks a bit different. What about corruption? Bribery in the system?
Still reported as a problem. Allegations of guards taking bribes for better treatment, better food, maybe a phone influencing parole continue to surface. Plus, just general bureaucratic delays for things like parole hearings or getting transferred to a hospital can make things much worse for inmates.
It's quite striking how many of the issues Midnight Express highlighted, maybe in a sensational way, still seem to be present in some form today. You mentioned firsthand accounts. What do more recent ones tell us?
Yeah, those recent accounts are really insightful. Ahmed Altan, the journalist who was jailed for several years,
I remember reading about him.
he called Silivri prison a modern dungeon. He noted it was cleaner, more modern physically than the old prisons, but talked about oppressive surveillance, very limited contact with the outside.
So, a different kind of hardship, maybe.
Exactly. And Selahattin Demirtas, the Kurdish politician in prison since 2016, consistently reports overcrowding and limited medical care themes straight out of the 70s accounts.
Any others?
Even foreign journalists detained more recently, like Peter Gress from Australia, while they might acknowledge better physical facilities in some places, they still emphasize the huge psychological strain of isolation and legal uncertainty.
So the takeaway from these recent stories,
It seems to be that while some physical conditions might have improved in some places, those underlying psychological pressures and systemic problems, especially for political detainees, are very much still a reality.
it's clear the legacy of that film, or rather the issues it raised, is still very relevant. Given all this, what actual efforts have been made over the years to reform the system? Did the Midnight Express scandal actually lead to change?
It definitely acted as a catalyst. That international spotlight created pressure both inside and outside Turkey. So yes, there were reform initiatives over the decades.
Like what? Fixing the buildings?
That was part of it. In the 80s and 90s, some older prisons like Imrala and Bayrampaşa were renovated, supposedly to improve sanitation and living spaces.
And then the F-type prisons you mentioned.
Right, starting in the 2000s. These were high security, designed with smaller cells, supposedly better hygiene, more modern, a big construction program.
Was it just about bricks and mortar? Any legal changes?
Oh yeah, significant ones. The 2004 Penal Code overhaul was huge. It aimed to bring Turkey's justice system, including prisons, more in line with EU standards.
What did that mean for prisoners?
Stronger rights on paper, better access to medical care, meeting lawyers privately, family visits. They also expanded probation and parole options, trying to tackle that chronic overcrowding.
And the EU connection played a role.
Definitely. Turkey's bid to join the EU meant more scrutiny from bodies like the CPT, the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. They started doing regular inspections, making recommendations.
Any focus on rehabilitation, education?
Some prisons did start introducing programs, yeah. Vocational training, literacy classes, even things like computer courses or art therapy in some places.
Okay, so it sounds like quite a lot was attempted.
Yeah.
How successful were these reforms? Did they actually work?
It's a mixed bag, really. There were some definite positives.
Such as?
Well, that CPT report from 2019 praised Turkey for reducing juvenile detention rates and improving medical access in some newer facilities. And those F-type prisons in places like Ankara and Istanbul do generally meet more modern standards, individual cells, recreation areas.
Anything else?
Foreign prisoners often get better consular support now, and changes in drug laws mean fewer people locked up just for drug offenses, potentially.
Okay, so some bright spots. But you said it's a mixed bag. What were the limitations? Where did it fall short?
Well, the biggest factor derailing progress has been the political situation, especially post-2016.
The coup attempt again.
Exactly. The mass arrests put immense strain back on the system. Overcrowding surged again, and reports suggest many earlier gains were rolled back, especially for political prisoners who faced harsher conditions and fewer rights. Amnesty called the violations against them systematic in 2022.
So political events undid some reforms. Any other problems?
Implementation has been inconsistent. Reforms might happen in a big city prison, but rural or smaller ones lag behind due to budget issues or staff shortages. There also seems to be a kind of cultural resistance sometimes. Some officials still view prisoners, especially political ones, primarily as security threats, not people with rights. That undermines genuine rehabilitation efforts.
And corruption. Did the reforms fix that?
Doesn't seem like it, entirely. Reports of bribery for privileges persist. Transparency International highlighted this in 2023. It just erodes any sense of fairness.
So the government might point to Billions invested in new buildings.
Right. They do claim significant investment since 2000. But critics often argue that's just superficial. Fixing buildings doesn't fix deeper problems like lack of judicial independence or the need for better staff training and attitudes.
It really paints a picture of a system pulled in different directions. Modernization efforts clashing with entrenched issues and political turmoil. Let's focus specifically on the human rights angle now. What are the main violations that groups are still reporting today?
The reports remain deeply concerning. That CPT report from 2022 we mentioned. It found overcrowding in most facilities, healthcare access still insufficient, sometimes dangerously so, and credible allegations of torture and ill treatment, especially in high-security prisons holding political detainees.
Wow, still finding torture allegations in 2022.
Yes, and restrictions on access to lawyers and families, particularly for those labeled terrorists.
Any other bodies weighing in?
The European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR, it's repeatedly ruled against Turkey for prison conditions and treatment, found violations of Article 3, the prohibition of torture and inhuman treatment in multiple cases, like one in 2021 involving a Kurdish prisoner in prolonged solitary confinement.
And are certain groups more likely to suffer these violations? Who is most vulnerable inside?
Yes, definitely. Political prisoners are a major group. Journalists, academics, activists arrested post-2016. Human Rights Watch estimated around 20,000 people jailed for political reasons in 2023. They often face the harshest conditions.
Anyone else?
Women in prison have reported sexual harassment and abuse. Juveniles held in adult facilities are at high risk, according to UNICEF.
And foreigners.
Still facing those language barriers, difficulties getting consular help quickly, echoing the problems from decades ago, it seems these vulnerable groups bear the brunt of the system's failings.
With all these ongoing reports, is the international community putting pressure on Turkey?
There is pressure, yes. The UN's review of Turkey's human rights record in 2020 criticized prison conditions and called for independent monitoring. NGOs like the Helsinki Citizens Assembly work on the ground, providing legal aid. And international campaigns like #FreeTurkey's try to raise awareness.
Does that pressure work?
It's complicated. The Turkish government often dismisses this kind of criticism as politically motivated interference. So achieving change through external pressure alone is difficult.
A very complex picture indeed. Let's bring it back to where we started, Midnight Express. What's its lasting legacy, culturally and politically?
It left a huge, mostly negative mark on how the world saw Turkish prisons. It created this powerful image of cruelty and inhumanity that's been really hard for Turkey to shake off.
Did it damage relations?
Oh, yeah. It strained U.S.-Turkey relations significantly for a while, and the film itself was banned in Turkey until 1993.
And the stereotypes.
Unfortunately, it fueled a lot of negative stereotypes about Turkish people being brutal, which even Billy Hayes later regretted, acknowledging the film was very one-sided.
So its legacy is complicated.
Definitely a double-edged sword. It exposed real abuses, maybe pushed some reforms eventually. But it also created this persistent negative image, maybe an unfair one in some ways.
Are there attempts to counter that image now?
Yeah, you see some Turkish media like the show Pınar, Prison Brides, trying to offer more nuanced, humanized stories about prisoners, maybe partly to counter that old sensationalism.
Interesting how media shapes perception over decades. Beyond its historical impact, how relevant is the story of Midnight Express today?
I think it remains relevant as a touchstone for prison reform discussions globally. The issues it raised, overcrowding, abuse of power, corruption. Sadly, these aren't unique to 1970s Turkey. They exist in many prison systems worldwide.
And the experience of the foreigner.
That feeling of alienation, vulnerability, being caught in a system you don't understand, that still resonates strongly with the experiences of migrants, asylum seekers, even tourists detained abroad today.
So it still speaks to universal themes.
Absolutely. And it highlights the power of storytelling, doesn't it? How a powerful narrative can bring uncomfortable truths to light and potentially drive change.
Absolutely. So looking forward now, based on everything we've discussed, what are the most critical steps needed for real, lasting reform in Turkish prisons?
Several things stand out. First, tackling overcrowding has to be priority one. That probably means a mix of things, maybe expanding facilities selectively, but more importantly, using alternatives to locking people up, like more house arrest for nonviolent offenses. The 2020 amnesty showed releasing people is possible.
Okay, reduce the numbers. What else?
Independent oversight. Real, unfettered access for NGOs, human rights groups, lawyers to monitor conditions. That's crucial for accountability. Then, training for prison staff. Big focus on de-escalation, human rights, respecting dignity, maybe looking at models like Norway, which emphasizes rehabilitation.
Change the culture inside.
Exactly. And fundamental judicial reforms strengthening independence to limit arbitrary arrests, especially politically motivated ones. That builds trust.
And for the prisoners themselves.
A much bigger focus on actual rehabilitation, expanding education, therapy, job training inside prison. That's key to reducing recidivism, which is reportedly quite high.
Are there models elsewhere Turkey could learn from? Other countries doing things differently?
Yeah, several. Norway, as I mentioned, has very low reoffending rates, focusing on humane conditions and rehabilitation. Germany uses community sentences effectively. South Africa's post-apartheid reforms show how a system can change, improving healthcare and oversight after periods of abuse.
So international examples exist.
Definitely. And collaborating more with groups like the UN or EU could bring in funding, expertise, and help align the system with international standards.
This has been, wow, an incredibly comprehensive and frankly quite sobering look at this whole issue.
It really is complex.
We started with Midnight Express, that sensational starting point, and journeyed through the historical context, the reforms, some successful, some not, and the really persistent challenges that still exist today, especially according to human rights groups and recent accounts.
Yeah, it's clear that while some things have improved, especially physically in some newer prisons, the overall picture is still deeply shadowed by overcrowding, serious abuse allegations, and the impact of political imprisonment.
The progress seems constantly undermined by these deeper systemic issues.
Precisely. The shockwaves from Midnight Express did force some changes, but the experiences of prisoners today, particularly vulnerable groups, are a stark reminder that those fundamental problems highlighted decades ago still haven't been fully resolved.
It really makes you think about that balance, doesn't it, between punishment and rehabilitation, and just the global struggle for humane prison systems everywhere,
Absolutely.
and how that film, flawed as it was, undeniably forced a conversation that needed to happen and maybe still needs to happen. We hope this deep dive has given you listening a much clearer, more nuanced picture of Turkish prisons beyond the movie, looking at the long, complicated reality.
And maybe highlights just how powerful media can be, for better or worse, in shaping how we see the world and maybe even changing it.